They came to inventory a graveyard. They brought clerks instead of gunners. They left under tow, and they paid for the fuel. The Kestrel Deep began past the orbit of Neptune and ended nowhere in particular. It was not a system. It was not a station. It was a stretch of cold sky where the sun was only the brightest star in a crowd of them, and where 288 ships had been parked in rows and left there. The rows sat 4 kilometers apart. The ships were dark. Frost had built up on their upper plating in a fine gray crust, the way it builds on a truck left in a field over a long winter, and it had been scraped back in patches wherever somebody needed to read a hull number. 5 yards served them, yard 1 through yard 5, strung across 160,000 kilometers of nothing, each one a knot of cradles and lockers and pressurized sheds, each one lit by work lamps and nothing else. From a distance, the whole arrangement looked like a rail siding at 3 in the morning. That was, in the opinion of every survey ever filed on it, exactly what it was. The Ossuran Compact arrived on a Tuesday, by the local reckoning, which nobody aboard the Compact ships knew or cared about. 62 hulls came out of transit in a single ordered block, decelerated on schedule, and took station without a wasted maneuver. 46,500 crew. 4 heavy escorts forward, the rest in a shallow bowl behind them. It was not an attack formation. It was the formation you use when you are going to spend 3 weeks reading serial numbers off things. Marshal Vecht stood on the command deck of the flagship Assay and looked at the rows. The Assay carried 1,250 crew and a stain on the deck plate near the navigation station that 4 different crews had failed to remove. Vecht had stopped seeing the stain a long time ago. He was looking at the ships. He had commanded seizures before. 9 worlds had handed him their reserve inventories over the course of his career, and every one of them had looked roughly like this. Rows, dust, numbers. Somebody's grandfather's war, sitting out in the cold because nobody had the heart to cut it up. He knew the shape of the job. The job was counting. The job was always counting. Sub-Marshal Sem came to stand at his shoulder with a reader in her hand. She was younger, careful, and had a habit of holding a document at arm's length before she read from it, as though it might have opinions. Registry entry for the local holding, she said. Declared warship tonnage, 0. Declared naval personnel, 0. Declared construction, 0, for 214 years. Vecht nodded slowly. And the hulls? He asked. Sem read it out flat. 288 hulls in civil custody, book value, 0. That was the sentence. That was the whole thing right there in the second week of the story, said by a competent officer reading a competent document that had been assembled by competent people. Book value, 0. It would be said many more times before the end, and each time it would mean something slightly worse. The Compact was, above all else, an accounting civilization. It had grown across 400 systems not by conquering them, but by auditing them. Its strength was measured in tonnage and commission, because tonnage and commission was the only figure anyone could verify. A ship in commission had a crew list, a fuel draw, a supply contract, a berth fee. A ship out of commission had none of those. It had a custody number and a maintenance code, and under Compact convention, it was carried on the books at nothing at all. 0 multiplied by 288 is 0. Every clerk in the registry had checked that arithmetic. Every one of them had gotten it right. 214 years earlier, Earth had signed the Sable Accords at the end of a war it had not started and had comprehensively lost. The terms were simple and, by the standards of such things, generous. No occupation, no indemnity, trade lanes left open. In exchange, Earth would hold no warship in commission, would field no naval personnel, and would build no new hull of military class, ever. Earth signed. Earth complied. Earth had complied for 214 years without a single recorded violation. which the compact regarded as a triumph of its own patience, and which the registry regarded as a closed file. What the Accords did not say, because nobody at the table thought it needed saying, was anything at all about repair. Vecht walked the length of the command deck with his hands behind his back. Through the forward viewport, the nearest row of hulls lay stacked in perspective, one behind another, going gray with distance. Some of them were enormous. He had read the class designations that morning and had not been impressed. Old designs, pre-Accord frames, the kind of thing you find in a museum with a rope around it. "How long for the count?" he asked. 22 days if they cooperate, Sem said. 34 if they are slow about it. And if they refuse? She lowered the reader. "Then we find out," she said. Nobody refused. That was the strange part, and Vecht noticed it and set it aside, the way a man notices a sound in his engine on a long drive and decides it is probably nothing. The Reserve Yards Authority answered the first hail inside 4 minutes. A civilian voice, an older woman, unhurried, gave the compact a docking corridor, a set of pressure protocols, and the working hours of the yard canteen. She asked whether the boarding parties had any dietary restrictions. She said the coffee was bad, but hot. It was, Sem said later, the most courteous surrender she had ever been handed, and she had been handed several. The woman's name was Hannah Duarte, and she had been director of the Reserve Yards Authority for 7 years. Her office was in Yard 3, in a shed with a floor that had been painted safety yellow so many times the corners had gone rounded. Her desk had a drawer that stuck. In the drawer was a thing she had not taken out in 7 years. It would come out on the 58th day. Vecht watched the first shuttles cross the gap toward Yard 3. They looked very small against the hulls. He felt something then, a small, wrong note, the way you feel a step that is not where you expected it. He could not name it and did not try. He had a schedule, and the schedule said the count began at the top of the hour. "Begin the count," he said. 8 months before any of that, on a lower floor of the registry building on Ossuran, a ledger assessor named Vosk had done something unusual for her department. She had read a file nobody had asked her to read. Vosk was 32, held the second lowest grade of assessor available to an adult, and had been assigned to reconciliation, which meant she spent her days matching maintenance codes against parts invoices to catch fraud. She was good at it, and being good at it had gotten her exactly nowhere, because catching fraud in a maintenance ledger is the kind of achievement that does not survive contact with a promotion board. She had pulled the Earth custody file because the numbers were beautiful. That was the only reason. She liked a clean ledger the way some people like a clean kitchen. Earth's file was the cleanest she had ever seen. 214 years of continuous entries, no gaps, no corrections, no disputed invoices. Every line item was filed under the same convention, like for like. It took her 4 days to understand what she was looking at, and when she understood it, she stood up from her desk and did not sit back down for some time. Like for like was a maintenance code. It meant a component had been removed and replaced with a component of the same function and rating. It was the single most boring code in the entire compact taxonomy. It required no declaration, no license, no notification, and no audit, because under any sane reading it changed nothing. A pump for a pump, a plate for a plate, a conduit for a conduit. Nobody audits a pump. Vosk ran the totals. Against a single hull, custody number 6, the Reserve Yards Authority had logged 4,200,000 work orders since the signing of the Accords. She checked it twice because it was absurd. 4,200,000 work orders over 214 years came out at roughly 54 a day, every day, without a break, through every generation of every family that had ever worked in that yard. And every one of them was like for like. And every one of them was, technically, legally, and on the record, not construction. She wrote a memorandum. It ran to 4 pages, which was 3 pages longer than anything she had written before, and it was addressed to the Office of Strategic Reconciliation, which was the correct office, and it was filed through the correct channel with the correct routing code. The last line of it was 13 words long. A hull that is repaired forever is a hull that is built forever. She filed it and she waited. Nobody answered. Not a rejection, not a query, not an acknowledgement of receipt. The system that returned a receipt for a canteen requisition returned nothing at all for this. And Vosk checked the channel every morning for 6 weeks and then stopped checking, because there is a limit to how many times a person can look at an empty box. Marshal Vecht would read that sentence of hers again on the 52nd day, in a different room, with a different expression on his face, and he would not argue with it. The assembly convened aboard the assay on the second day, in the long compartment the Compact used for expedition councils. It had bad lighting. Every navy and every arm of the galaxy has at some point decided that the room where decisions are made should be lit from directly overhead, and every one of them has been wrong. 22 officers sat around a table that had been designed for 18. Vecht sat at the head of it with a cup of something warm that he did not drink. Vosk was there because reconciliation had sent a body, and she was the body it had available. She sat at the far end near the door, holding a reader, and for the first hour she said nothing, because nothing had been asked of her. The count reports came in first. Yard 3, cooperative. Yard 1, cooperative. Yard 5, cooperative, and offering the use of a heated locker room. Serial numbers match the custody file. Hull numbers match the custody file. Everything matched the custody file. "It is going well," said the logistics officer, and he meant it, and he was correct, and that was the problem. Sem spoke next, and she began the way she always began, with a rank. "Marshal," she said. "One item." Vecht looked up. "The workforce," she said. "The registry lists no naval personnel. It does not list the civil workforce because the civil workforce is not our concern. But our boarding teams counted people. In Yard 3 alone, the head count on shift was over 11,000. She let that sit. "The authority employs 58,000 across the 5 yards. Somebody down the table said that maintenance was labor-intensive. Somebody else said that a hull that size takes a village. Both of those things were true." Vecht said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the shape of a number. 58,000 people, and not one of them a sailor, and every one of them holding a tool inside a warship. "They are dock workers," the logistics officer said. "Yes," Vecht said. "That is what the file says." And then Vosk, from the far end of the table, near the door, said, "Marshal, may I speak to the file?" Heads turned. She stood because she did not know that assessors at her grade were supposed to stay seated, and she put her reader on the table and did not look at it because she had the numbers by heart. She told them about like for like. She told them what a maintenance code is and why nobody audits one, in plain words, twice, because the first time she saw that half the table had not followed. She told them that 4,200,000 work orders had been logged against a single hull, and that the hull was still carried at book value 0, and that both of those statements were correct at the same time. She told them that under the Accords, Earth could not build a warship, and that under the Accords, nothing whatsoever prevented Earth from replacing every single component of a warship it already owned, one part at a time, for 2 centuries with better parts, provided each part performed the same function as the one it replaced. "We are not looking at old ships," she said. "We are looking at ships that have been rebuilt more thoroughly than anything in our own fleet, using a procedure we invented, filed under a code we do not read." There was a silence of perhaps 4 seconds. Then the process took over, and the process was not malicious. And that is the part that matters. The senior assessor present pointed out correctly that Reconciliation Grade 2 carried no assessment authority in an operational theater. The legal officer pointed out correctly that the custody entries were valid and had never been challenged. The logistics officer pointed out correctly that the registry had received a memorandum on this subject 8 months prior, and had issued no instruction, and that in the absence of instruction, the standing valuation stood. Every one of them was following a rule that existed for a good reason. Vecht let it run. Then he asked one question, and it was the right question, and it did not help. "Assessor," he said, "what is your evidence that any of these hulls can move?" Vosk did not answer right away. "I have no evidence they can move," she said. "I have 4,200,000 receipts saying somebody has spent 2 centuries making sure they can." "That is not the same thing," the senior assessor said. "No," Vosk said. "It is worse." The record shows that her statement was entered as noted. The record shows that no instruction was generated. Vecht sat with it for the rest of the session, and the small wrong note he had felt on the command deck the day before came back and stood beside him, and he still could not name it. He was not a stupid man, and he was not a cruel one. He had been given an assessment produced by the finest accounting apparatus in the known galaxy, and that apparatus had never been wrong about a fleet in his lifetime. And the alternative was to tell 400 systems that his expedition had stalled because a grade 2 clerk had a feeling about pumps. At the end of the session, he signed the seizure order. It transferred custody of all 288 hulls to the Compact, effective on the 3rd day, and it authorized boarding teams to take physical control of yard infrastructure, including cradles, tugs, and lockers. He signed it with an old metal pen that had belonged to his predecessor. It was the last order he gave that everyone in the room agreed with. The 3rd day began badly for a man named Joaquin Ferreira, who had worked in the paint shop at Yard 3 for 14 years, and who did not, at that hour, know that anything at all had been signed. He was in a lift cage 40 meters up the flank of Custody Hull 6, with a sprayer and 2 liters of primer, doing the job he had been given on Friday. The Compact boarding officer who found him spoke good English and was polite about it. The officer explained that the hull was now Compact property, that all work was suspended, and that Ferreira should power down the cage and come out. Ferreira listened. Then he said, "It needs paint." The officer explained again. Ferreira said the plating had been stripped back to bare metal on Thursday, and that bare metal out here goes to powder in about 9 days, and that he had been told to prime it, so he was going to prime it. He was not angry. He did not raise his voice. He simply had a can of primer and a stripped plate and 40 years of institutional habit standing behind him like a wall. The officer, who had a schedule, made a decision that was reasonable and would be examined for a very long time afterward. He left him to it. It was 200 square meters of primer on a ship that was, on paper, worth nothing. It cost the Compact nothing. It changed nothing. Later, people would ask Joaquin Ferreira about that morning, once that same week, and once 26 years afterward, and both times he would answer with the same 3 words. It needed paint. By the 4th day, the Compact held every yard, every cradle, every locker, and every list. The count was ahead of schedule. Sem walked the deck plating of Yard 3 with a portable reader and found the place cleaner than any naval facility she had ever inspected. Tools racked by size, floors marked with tape that had been renewed rather than patched, a chalkboard by the airlock with a walk-down list on it, 60-odd items in 3 different hands, most of them ticked. The canteen served, as promised, bad coffee. She drank it. She noted in her log that the workforce was orderly, unarmed, and unremarkable, and that morale appeared normal, and she was right about all 3, and she had no framework in which to understand what any of it meant. Nobody had stopped working. That was the thing that did not fit and that no boarding officer wrote down because there was no field on the form for it. The Compact had taken possession of 5 industrial yards and 58,000 employees, and the employees had continued, calmly and without discussion, to do their jobs. Pumps came out and went back in. Conduits were tested. Somebody in Yard 5 spent the afternoon of the 4th day rewinding a motor. Director Duarte spent the fourth day in her office with the door open, signing work orders. She signed 61 of them. Every one of them was coded like for like. On the fifth day, the compact escort Terre was detached to survey the far end of Yard 4, where the largest cradle sat because the survey plan called for it. Terre was a good ship, 700,000 tons, 460 crew, 12 years old, with a captain who filed on time. She reported entering the cradle field at the 18th hour. She reported the field as inactive. She reported a routine sweep. Then she reported nothing. There was no distress signal. There was no debris. There was no energy discharge of any kind recorded by any of the 61 remaining compact hulls. And the compact sensors were the finest instruments any of its member species had ever built. And they had been watching. A ship of 700,000 tons had gone into a stretch of empty space full of parked scrap, and it had stopped talking. Vecht was woken at the 20th hour. He read the report standing up, in the dark, in a corridor outside his cabin, with a junior signals officer holding a light for him. He read it 3 times. Then he read it again. "Say the last position," he said. The officer said it. Vecht looked down the corridor at the stain on the deck plate that no crew had been able to remove, 40 meters away and around a corner, which he could not see and knew was there. "Confirm the count," he said. "How many hulls do we have?" 61, Marshal." The Reserve Yards Authority ran out of a shed. That was the first thing anyone noticed who ever came to see it, and almost nobody ever came to see it. Yard 3, Building 2, 1 story, prefabricated, with a heating system that had been like for like replaced 4 times and still could not keep the north end warm. Duarte's office was at the north end. She wore a coat indoors. On the 5th day, at the 21st hour, she sat at her desk with the doors shut and 11 people standing around the walls, because there were 4 chairs. Nobody had brought a reader. There was a whiteboard with a bad hinge. Chief Shipwright Walter Bell, 54 years old, and 31 of those years in the yards, stood by the board with a marker in his hand and did not use it. "Terre is held," he said. "Cradle 9 at Yard 4 took her at the 18th hour. She is undamaged. Her crew is alive. She is not going anywhere." Somebody at the back exhaled. Duarte did not. "Say the honest number, Walter," she said. Bell said the honest number. "Across 5 yards we have 38 cradles and 122 tugs. If they come at us properly, at once, with intent, we hold maybe half of what they have, and we lose the yards. If they come at us in pieces, we hold more." He set the marker down. "Hull 6 can move. Hulls 2, 4, 7, and 12 can move. 16 can move if we get 4 days. The rest are exactly what the file says they are." Duarte nodded. "And 6, she said. "Say it properly." Bell said it properly because he had said it to apprentices twice a year for 3 decades, and he could not say it any other way. "Custody, Hull 6. 1,860 meters. 3.6 million tons. Design crew of 3,400. Laid down before the Accords and never once, in 214 years, allowed to fall out of test. Every pump on her had been changed. Every conduit. Every plate on her flanks. Some of them 4 times. Her main batteries had been pulled, stripped, gauged and reseated on a rotation that came around every 6 years, and the last complete rotation had finished in the spring. Her reactors had been run up to 70% every 80 days since before anybody in the room was born, because the standing instruction said a cold reactor is a dead reactor, and nobody had ever rescinded the standing instruction. 4,200,000 work orders, about 54 a day, every one of them like for like. There is a thing that happens to institutions nobody audits, and it is not the thing people expect. The expectation is corruption. The reality sometimes is the opposite. An institution nobody audits, and nobody funds, and nobody visits, and nobody promotes out of will, If it is left alone long enough, and if it is given one clear job, occasionally just does that job. Not well, perfectly, because there is nothing else to do, and because the people in it are judged by each other and by nobody above them, and because the alternative to doing the job properly is standing in a cold shed with nothing to be proud of. The Reserve Yards Authority had a budget line, a mandate, and no oversight whatsoever for 214 years. It had kept 288 ships in a condition that no navy in the galaxy had ever attempted. And it had done it because keeping ships was the job, and the job was the whole world. "What do we do?" asked a woman by the door. Duarte looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Nothing," she said. "We keep working." "Director, we hold tear. We do not fire on anyone. We keep every shift on rotation, and we sign every order, and we let them count." "And six?" Duarte said the two words she would say 11 more times over the following weeks, and every time she said them, she would say them exactly the same way, without heat, like a woman declining a second helping. "Not yet." The meeting broke up at the 22nd hour. Bell walked back through Building 2 and out along the covered way to the cradle deck. And on the way, he passed the paint shop, where the lights were still on. Ferreira was cleaning a sprayer. He did that every night. He had done it every night for 14 years, and he would do it that night whether the shed belonged to Earth or to the Ossuran Compact or to nobody at all. Bell stopped in the doorway. "Joaquin," he said, "the bow plate." Ferreira did not look up. "Prime this morning," he said. "Top coat Thursday." Bell stood there a second longer. "Put the name back on it," he said. The name had been painted over in the second year after the Accords, along with 287 others, because the terms required that no hull in custody display naval markings. The yards had complied. They had complied with a single coat of gray, applied by hand, over letters that had been cut into the plate rather than painted on, and they had never once in 2 centuries filled the letters in. Any shipwright who ran a hand over that plate could read it with the lights off. On the 7th day, Joaquin Ferreira went up in the lift cage with a sprayer, a stencil he did not need, and a can of white, and he put the name back on the bow of Custody, Hull 6. It took him 2.5 hours. It was, in terms of tonnage, ordnance, and strategic effect, the least significant act performed by any human being that entire month. Nobody organized it. Nobody voted on it. When he came down, he racked the sprayer, signed the shop log, and went to the canteen for the bad coffee. A compact boarding officer photographed the bow that afternoon and filed the image with a note that the local workforce appeared to be conducting unauthorized cosmetic work. The note was entered as observed. It generated no instruction. The letters said Mount Hope. Attrition is a word that sounds like combat and is usually paperwork. Over the next fortnight, the compact expedition did not fight a battle. It lost things. On the 8th day, a survey shuttle went into the Yard 1 cradle field and did not come out. And when a second shuttle was sent after it, it found the first one sitting perfectly intact, with all 6 crew aboard, unharmed, unable to move, and quite unable to explain why. On the 10th day, a tender lost attitude control for 40 minutes inside Yard 2 and drifted 3 kilometers off its assigned track. And the incident was logged as a helm fault, and the helm was found to be in perfect order. On the 12th day, a heavy escort called Margin reported that its inertial screens had been engaged for 11 straight hours by something the screens described as a home-matching field, which was a category of contact its threat library did not contain, because a home-matching field is not a weapon. It is what a dry dock uses to hold a ship still while people work on it. Sem brought the list to Vecht on the 14th day, and she brought it on paper because paper is harder to ignore. 18 incidents, she said. No casualties, no damage, no weapons fire, ours or theirs. "Then what am I looking at?" Vecht asked. "Marshal," she said, and stopped and started again, because there was no clean way to say it. "We are being held. not attacked, held. Vecht went to the viewport. Below and ahead, Yard 3 was doing what Yard 3 did. Work lamps, a tug moving a plate, a lift cage crawling up the flank of a dark hull. Nothing had changed in the picture since the day he arrived. And that was the point, and it took him some minutes to understand that it was the point. 58,000 people had been told their yards were now foreign property, and they had gone back to work. He had taken possession of a machine that had never once stopped running, and possession had not stopped it either. Send to the registry, he said. Priority, full incident schedule, the assessor's memorandum attached, and my request for a revised valuation of the local holding. Sem wrote it down. And my request for authority to withdraw to standoff distance pending that valuation. She looked up. Send it, he said. The registry did not answer. It is worth being precise about what that means because it is the hinge of the entire affair. The message was received. It was logged. It entered the queue at the Office of Strategic Reconciliation at Ossuran on the 15th day, where it was routed by code to the desk that handled valuation disputes for custodial holdings. And the queue for that desk was, at that moment, 430 items long, and the desk was staffed by 2 people, one of whom was on leave. There was no conspiracy. There was no villain. There was a queue. On the 22nd day, Vecht sent again, longer, with the loss of tear rendered as a table. On the 30th day, he sent a third time, and this one he wrote himself, at the 23rd hour in his own words, and it was the least formal document of his career. He asked for an instruction, any instruction. He said he would accept a refusal. Nobody answered. Not a rejection, not a query, not an acknowledgement of receipt. And a marshal of the Ossuran Compact discovered what a Grade 2 assessor had discovered 8 months earlier, which is that there is no argument you can win against an empty box. Meanwhile, the ledger moved. On the 16th day, the count of compact hulls able to maneuver freely inside the yard volumes fell from 61 to 54, and the 7 were not destroyed. They were simply somewhere they could not leave. On the 20th day, it was 48. Fuel consumption rose 30% across the expedition because a ship holding position against a hull-matching field burns fuel the way a man burns breath pushing a car. On the 22nd day, the assay's own screen operator reported a contact and then withdrew the report. And the withdrawal was the thing that told Vecht how bad it had gotten, because an officer who withdraws a report has stopped trusting the instrument. Sem found him that night on the command deck with the lights down. Marshal, she said, the crews are asking what the loss rate is. Tell them the honest number, he said. She did not move. What does that mean for the rest of us? She said, and it was not a question, and he did not answer it. On the 24th day, the expedition's effective hull count was 44. On the 28th day, it was 40. 62 at the start. Dock 4 at Yard 2 was the worst room in the Reserve Yards Authority. It had a light that flickered on the left side, a floor that sweated in the cold, a coffee machine that dispensed something the shift called brake fluid, and 3 people in it at 3 in the morning on the 20th day. Nadia Ilves ran the Cradle Systems Group. Sam Okafor was a controls technician who had transferred in from asteroid haulage and had never quite lost the habit of talking about ships as cargo. Theodore Vance was 78, had retired twice, and came in anyway because his wife had died and the shed was warm. The problem on the board was simple and looked unsolvable. The Compact's ships carried inertial screens. An inertial screen is a field that refuses incoming energy and incoming mass, and it refuses both extremely well, and every navy in the galaxy had spent 3 centuries trying to punch through one and had gotten precisely nowhere except by building bigger guns. Ilves had spent 2 weeks trying to model a way through. She had filled the board twice and wiped it twice. At the 3rd hour, Theodore got up, walked to the board, and said the group had been thinking about it wrong. Ilves said it was late. He picked up the marker anyway. A screen refuses things that come at it, he said. We keep trying to send something at it. He drew a rectangle. That is a hull. He drew a shape around it, open at both ends. That is a cradle. What does a cradle do? Okafor said, holds a ship. How? Okafor started to answer and stopped. Theodore tapped the board twice. It matches, it reads the mass distribution, and it makes a field that fits it, and then it does not push and it does not pull. It just declines to let the hull go anywhere. Their screen has nothing to refuse. Nothing is coming at it. Nobody said anything for a moment. The light on the left flickered. That is what we do, Theodore said. We hold ships. We have held ships for 214 years. Nobody in the galaxy has ever bothered to defend against a dry dock, because a dry dock is not a weapon. The engineering was not glamorous, and it was not quick. A cradle at Yard 3 was rated at 5 million tons of hold, which meant it could take Mount Hope with room to spare, and which also meant it could take 7 Ossuran cruisers of 700,000 tons apiece at once. But cradles do not move. Tugs move. There were 122-yard tugs across the 5 yards, each rated at 80,000 tons of hold, each fitted with a cradle standard matching head, because standardization is what a maintenance authority does instead of having ideas. Okafor spent 2 days working out that 11 tugs, phased together, could produce a composite hold on a hull of 800,000 tons for as long as the fuel lasted. Ilves spent 2 days working out how to phase them without shaking the tugs apart. Theodore spent 2 days writing the procedure down in plain language on numbered cards, because he had been an instructor once, and he did not trust anything that could not be read aloud by a tired person at 4 in the morning. On the 24th day, the first composite hold was applied to a compact escort inside Yard 1, and the escort noticed nothing except that its position would not change. On the 26th day, 2 more. On the 30th day, 5 in a single hour. None of it was reported to the compact by anyone, because the yards had no obligation to report anything, and nobody had asked. Duarte watched the tally on a paper sheet on her wall, updated in pencil. Bell came in on the 32nd day and stood by her desk. We have 19 of them held across 4 yards, he said. We could take the flagship tomorrow. Duarte looked at the sheet. Not yet, she said. Director, if we take the flagship tomorrow, she said, they lose a marshal and they get a martyr, and the registry finally answers. And what it answers will not be evaluation. She put the pencil down. We hold. We keep holding. Every day we hold, it costs them more, and it costs us nothing. And one of those 2 facts will eventually reach somebody who can add. There was a young man in Yard 2 named Dev Marat, 23 years old, a cradle systems apprentice, who had helped Okafor phase the tugs, and who had been in the room when the procedure cards were written. He read the standing instruction that came down that afternoon. Hold, do not release, do not fire, do not respond to hail. He read it twice and concluded that the authority had gone soft. He was wrong, and he was about to be expensively wrong, and he would spend the next 26 years understanding exactly how. On the 36th day, the compact found tear. A recovery element with 3 escorts and a heavy tender went into the far end of Yard 4 under full screen, expecting a wreck field. They found a ship. Tear sat in Cradle 9, exactly where she had stopped 31 days earlier. Her hull was unmarked. Her running lights were on. Her reactors were at station keeping. Every one of her 460 crew was alive, fed, and extremely tired of one another. Her captain had filed a report every day of the 31, on schedule, because he was a man who filed on time. And the reports had gone nowhere because the yard's cradle field had been sitting quietly on his transmitter mast the entire time. The recovery officer walked her decks with a scanner and found no damage, no boarding, no intrusion, no fault of any kind. He climbed out onto the dorsal plating in a hardsuit and looked up the length of Cradle 9, at the gantries and the lockers and the taped-off walkways, and at a chalkboard bolted to a stanchion 60 meters away with a walk-down list on it in 3 different hands. He filed one line: "There is nothing wrong with this ship, and we cannot move it." The 44th day started like every other day in the Kestrel Deep, which is to say it did not start at all, because there was no sun to speak of, and the shift simply changed. At the 4th hour, the Compact's forward escorts reported that the yard tugs had stopped moving. All of them. 122 tugs across 5 yards went stationary within the same 11 minutes and sat there. At the 5th hour, the work lamps in Yard 3 went out. Not all the lights, just the work lamps, the yellow ones, the ones that meant a shift was on a hull. Sem was on the command deck of the assay when it happened, and she said afterward that she understood it immediately and completely, and that the understanding arrived before any evidence did. The Reserve Yards Authority had stopped working. At the 5th hour and 12 minutes, Custody Hull 6 lit up. Not slowly. She came up in tears, bow to stern, in the order a shipwright brings a hull up, and every tear came up on schedule, because the schedule was on a laminated card in a locker that had been reprinted 46 times. Her reactors went from station keeping to full in 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which is a number that appears in exactly one place, in a test procedure run every 80 days for 214 years by people who timed it with a stopwatch and wrote it in a book. Her running lights came on. Her flank plating shed frost in sheets. Along her bow, in white paint 8 days old, 400 meters of letters said, "Mount Hope." Vecht did not sit down. "Assessment," he said. There was no assessment. The Compact's threat library had no entry for the hull, because the hull was carried at book value 0. The library reported the contact as a custodial asset, non-propulsive, and continued to report that for 11 minutes while the asset accelerated. "Range," Vecht said, 4,000 kilometers and closing. "Her batteries. Marshal, her batteries are tracking us." 3.6 million tons came out of the row and turned. That was the moment, not the guns, the turn. 61 hulls had spent 44 days parked inside a rail siding, and the siding had decided to move. And every screen on every Compact ship in the Kestrel Deep filled with the same shape at once. Behind Mount Hope, in the second row, Custody Hull 2 lit her lamps. Then 4, then 7, then 12, then 16, 4 days late in coming anyway. 6 hulls out of 288, 2% of a fleet carried at nothing. The tugs moved at the 6th hour. They did not attack. They took station, 11 to a target, in the phasing pattern from Theodore's numbered cards, and they applied hold. The escort quorum found her heading locked and reported it. The escort set found she could not roll. Margin, which had been complaining about hull matching fields for a month, was taken by 14 tugs at once and simply stopped, mid-turn, at an angle like a photograph. Vecht ordered a general withdrawal at the 6th hour in 8 minutes. And it was a correct order, and it was 7 days too late. 28 hulls could not comply. They could not comply because they were held, and the crews were unhurt, and the reactors were fine, and the guns worked perfectly, and none of that mattered, because a warship that cannot change its position is a building. Mount Hope fired at the 6th hour in 22 minutes. Her main batteries were original. They had been laid down before the Accords, and they had been pulled, stripped, gauged, and reseated on a 6-year rotation, and the last rotation had completed in the spring, and every gauge reading from every rotation was in a book in a locker in Yard 3. She fired 8 rounds in the first minute at a range of 2,000 kilometers. She hit with 8. That is not a heroic number. It is a maintenance number. It is what a gun does when nothing on it has ever been allowed to wear past tolerance. The heavy escort Drame came apart on the second salvo. The escort Volk lost her forward third, and held together and pulled clear with 210 dead. The Compact's screens performed exactly as designed against the fire, and exactly as designed against the holds, which is to say, brilliantly against the first and not at all against the second, because a hull-matching field is not incoming. Sem stood at the plot and read positions out loud in a level voice and did not stop. And later she said that reading the plot out loud was the only thing she could think of to do that was useful. At the 7th hour, the assay took a hold from 19 tugs and shed it by burning her maneuvering reserve to nothing. And Vecht watched his fuel state go from adequate to critical in 4 minutes. At the 7th hour and 40 minutes, a young cradle apprentice named Dev Marat, in Yard 2, released the composite hold on a compact escort called Tear without authorization because he had decided that a held ship was a wasted ship and that the yards should be sinking them. Tear, freed, did the only sane thing a warship does when it is suddenly able to move inside a hostile volume. She ran, and she fired on the way out, and she put 4 rounds into the cradle gantries at Yard 2. There were people on those gantries. There were people in the locker rooms under them. 208 employees of the Reserve Yards Authority died in the Kestrel Deep over the course of that day, and 190 of them died in the 11 minutes after Dev Marat lifted a hold he had been instructed to keep. Bell was on the deck at Yard 3 when the casualty list started coming in by voice, name by name, from a shift supervisor who had no other way to send it. He wrote the names on the back of a work order because it was the paper he had. At the 8th hour, Duarte, in a shed at the north end of Building 2, gave the only order of the entire affair that anybody would later describe as a command. "Stop," she said. "Hold what we have, nothing more." Somebody asked whether Mount Hope should pursue the withdrawing hulls. She said no. She said it twice. Then she sat down and did not speak for 11 minutes, which the 4 people in the room with her all remembered, and none of them ever described as anything other than a woman sitting in a chair. The honest assessment was commissioned on the 48th day, and Marshal Vecht commissioned it from the only person aboard who had ever produced one. Vosk worked out of a supply compartment on the assay with a folding table and a reader and no assistance, and she delivered on the 52nd day. Vecht read it in the Expedition Council Room with the bad overhead lighting and 11 officers who had not slept properly in a week. The numbers came first because the numbers always come first. Expedition strength on arrival, 62 hulls. Destroyed, 4. Withdrawn under their own power, 30. Held, 28. All intact, all crewed, all immobile in 5-yard volumes, with a combined complement that Vosk stated as a figure and then, deliberately, stated again as a description. 21,400 of our people, she said, are sitting inside working ships that will not move, eating their reserve rations, and they will be doing that tomorrow as well. Compact dead, 2,600. Local dead, 208, of which 190 in a single incident that Vosk noted the authority had described in its own log as an unauthorized release. Nobody at the table found that comforting. Then she did the part she had been waiting 8 months to do, and she took no pleasure in it. She put the custody file back on the screen. 288 hulls, book value 0. Then she put the maintenance ledger beside it. 4,200,000 work orders against custody hull 6 alone. This is not a fleet that was hidden from us, she said. Nothing was hidden. Every entry is public. Every entry is correctly filed. We have had the entire thing on our own servers for 214 years, and we did not read it because our convention says a decommissioned hull is worth nothing, and a like-for-like replacement is not construction. She let that stand. We were not deceived. We were audited by our own rules and we passed. Vecht asked her to read the last line of her memorandum aloud. She read it. A hull that is repaired forever is a hull that is built forever. 13 words, filed 8 months earlier through the correct channel with the correct routing code, entered as noted, answered by nobody. The options came next, and they were laid out properly and rejected one at a time, which is the only respectable way to reject options. Reinforcement. 11 more hulls could be at the Kestrel Deep in 9 weeks, and Vosk pointed out that 11 hulls would be held in an afternoon by tugs the Authority could build in a shed, and that the Authority had 38 cradles and 122 tugs and could operate them with people who were not soldiers and would not need to be paid combat rates. Rejected. Bombardment from standoff range. Sem pointed out that the yards were 160,000 kilometers of dispersed sheds and cradles containing 21,400 compact personnel in held hulls. Rejected, and rejected fast. Blockade. The logistics officer ran the fuel figures and put his reader down halfway through. Rejected. Escalation to the full compact fleet, which was the option everybody in the room had been circling for an hour. Vecht asked one question. If we bring 400 hulls here, he said, what do we learn on the day we arrive? Vosk answered it. That 282 of their hulls are still parked, she said, and that we have never once seen what is inside them, and that the people who maintain them are still working. Nobody spoke for a while after that. Vecht walked to the compartment's small viewport afterward, alone, and looked out at the Kestrel Deep. He could see Yard 3 from where he stood. The work lamps were on again. They had come back on within 30 hours of the 44th day and had not gone off since, because there were plates to prime and pumps to change and a hull with battle damage on her flank that somebody had already chalked and tagged. 58,000 people had gone back to work. He had spent his whole career reading other people's ledgers, and he had never once thought to ask what a civilization does when you leave it alone with one job for 2 centuries. He thought about the stain on the deck plate near the navigation station that 4 crews had failed to remove, and about a chalkboard bolted to a stanchion in Cradle 9, and about the difference between the two. There was a word for what the Compact had done to Earth, and it was not oppression, and it was not neglect. The Compact had filed Earth under the wrong kind of thing entirely. It had put a shipyard in the column marked scrap, and then it had spent 214 years never opening the column again, because the column added up to nothing, and there is no reason to check a column that adds up to nothing. Sem found him at the viewport. Marshal, she said, the registry. He turned. It answered? No, he nodded slowly. He had known before he asked. Then we do not have instructions, he said, and we have not had instructions for 37 days, and every hour we wait costs us fuel we do not have and gives them a day they are happy to spend. He looked back at the lamps. Open a channel to the Authority, not to a government, to the Authority. Sem hesitated. What do I say? Vecht was quiet for a moment. Say that the marshal of the expedition requests to speak with the director, he said. Say please. They met on the 54th day in the canteen at Yard 3 because it was the largest heated room in the yards and because Duarte declined to hold it aboard a ship. The tables were bolted down. The coffee was bad and hot. Vecht came across with Sem, Vosk, and 2 aides, and Duarte met him with Bell and a woman from the Authority's records office, and nobody else. There was no flag, no tablecloth, no seal, and no recording device. And the whole thing began at 9 in the morning and ran for 4 days. Vecht opened with the thing he had come to say. I want my people back, he said, 21,400 of them. Duarte poured him coffee first, which is a small thing and was not accidental. Yes, she said, you can have them. Then she gave him 4 things without being asked, one after another, quickly, the way a person clears the small items off a table. The held hulls would be released in sequence over 16 days, crews intact, ships undamaged, in the order he chose. The Authority would supply fuel for the transit at cost. The Authority would return every item of compact property inventoried in the yards, down to the readers, and it had already been crated. And the Authority accepted, without argument or condition, that Earth had held no warship in commission on the day the compact arrived and had violated no term of the Sable Accords, and that whatever custody Hull 6 had been on the 44th day, she was going back into custody on the 60th. Sem, who had prepared for 3 weeks of hostile procedure, wrote all 4 down and then stopped writing and looked at Duarte. And Duarte was buttoning her coat because the north end of the canteen was cold. Vecht let the day run out before he came to the item that mattered. It came on the second morning, and he put it well, because he was not a fool. The compact was prepared, he said, to reopen the accords. Earth's declared tonnage cap could be lifted. Earth could commission ships, name them, sail them, register naval personnel, and take a seat in the tonnage assembly with a voice proportionate to its fleet. 288 hulls, entered on the register, would make Earth the 4th largest declared power in 400 systems. He watched her while he said it, and he saw exactly what he expected to see, which was nothing at all. There was one condition. The Reserve Yards Authority would be entered on the register as a naval institution and would be subject to compact audit, standard terms, annual inspection, full disclosure of maintenance codes and work orders. Duarte set down her cup. "No," she said.
"Director, I am offering you a fleet."
"I know. I am offering you the 4th chair in 400 systems." "I know what you are offering." She looked at the window, which was not a window but a panel painted to look like one, badly, in 1997 by somebody in the paint shop with time on their hands. "Take the tonnage back," she said. "Leave us at 0. They talked around it for 2 days and got nowhere, politely. On the 4th morning, Vecht asked everyone to leave the room. It was the only conversation of the entire affair, with no aides and no record. And both of them spoke about it afterward, and their accounts agree. He asked her why. He said he had beaten his head against the question for a week and could not make it come out sensible. He told her that what she was refusing was not vanity, it was protection. That a registered fleet is a fleet nobody comes to inventory, and that by staying at 0, she was guaranteeing that somebody, in 40 years or 400, would arrive at the Kestrel Deep with clerks and a schedule and make the same mistake all over again. Duarte agreed with every word of that. Then she told him why. And it is the only time in this entire account that anybody stated the thing outright. "The moment you audit us," she said, "we stop being a maintenance authority and start being a navy. Navies get budgets. Budgets get argued. Somebody in a committee looks at 4 million work orders and asks why we are replacing a pump that still works. And there is no good answer to that question, because there is no good answer. There is only the rule, like for like, every time, forever, whether anybody is watching or not." She turned the cup on the table a quarter turn. "You did not beat us because our guns were better. Your guns were better. You lost because for 214 years, nobody in this shed had anything to gain by cutting a corner, and nobody above us had any reason to make us. The day we are worth auditing is the day we start being managed, and the day we start being managed is the day somebody decides the 6-year gun rotation can go to 8. She looked at him. "Give us the fleet and you take the yards. Leave us at 0 and you leave us alone. I would rather be left alone." Vecht sat with that for a long moment. "That is a very strange thing to be proud of," he said. "It is not pride," Duarte said. "It is arithmetic." He signed on the 58th day in the canteen at a table bolted to the floor. The instrument was 3 pages long and it did 4 things. It confirmed the release schedule. It confirmed the fuel arrangement. It recorded that no term of the Sable Accords had been breached by either party. And it left the custodial valuation of the Earth holding exactly as it had stood since the signing, at book value 0, by the express request of the holding party. A clause the Compact's legal officer described in his own file note as the single most peculiar thing he had ever drafted. When the moment came, Duarte opened the drawer that stuck. Inside was a brass drift pin, worn bright at one end, that had belonged to her mother, who had worked cradles at Yard 5 for 32 years and had never been anything more than a cradle hand. She set it on the table beside the paper. She did not explain it, and nobody asked. She used it to hold the pages flat while Vecht signed, because the canteen ventilation blew across that table and always had. Then she picked it up, put it back in the drawer, and shook his hand. The consequences went outward the way they always do, through people who had nothing to do with any of it. Within a year, the Sathani Reach commissioned an audit of its own reserve holdings and discovered it had none, having sold them for scrap value in a good financial quarter 46 years earlier. The Volmer Assembly discovered that its reserve service existed on paper, employed 300 people, and had not turned a reactor in a century. 2 member states of the compact itself found that their custodial yards had been quietly folded into their active fleets during a reorganization, which meant every hull in them had been in commission, which meant every hull in them had been maintained to a fleet standard, which is to say to a standard set by whoever was being promoted that year. Across 400 systems, in the space of 18 months, a great many senior people learned that the cheapest line item in their budget had been the only one that compounded. The compact never did amend the like-for-like convention. It was studied twice, referred to committee, and left alone, on the grounds that changing it would require re-auditing every custodial holding in 400 systems, and nobody could face it. Assessor Vosk was promoted 2 grades and given an office with a door. She took it. She did not enjoy it. Sem found her on the transit home, standing in a corridor doing nothing at all, and asked whether it helped being right. Vosk thought about it. Being right about a bad thing is not the same as winning, she said. 2,600 of ours, 208 of theirs. I had it in a memorandum 8 months before anyone left orbit, and it did not save one of them, because the office it went to had 430 items in the queue. She was 33 by then. She kept a printed copy of the memorandum in a drawer for the rest of her career and never showed it to anybody. Dev Marat was removed from Cradle Systems on the 46th day. The reprimand ran to 1 page, and he read it, by his own account, several hundred times over the following year. And for most of that year, he understood it to mean that he had been the only person in the yards willing to be decisive. It took him longer than it should have to work out the other reading. He was reassigned to the paint shop at Yard 3 under Joaquin Ferreira, who did not mention the matter to him once in 3 years. Walter Bell went home on the 62nd day for the first time in 11 weeks. His kitchen had a note on the fridge in his daughter's handwriting about a dentist appointment that had happened a month earlier. He stood and read it for a while. Then he made toast, because there was nothing else in the house, and sat at the table with the work order in his pocket that had 208 names written on the back of it in pencil, and he did not take it out. Aurelio San came to the Kestrel Deep 26 years later. He was a historian. He was writing the only serious account of the affair anybody would produce, and he had a list of 11 questions and one that mattered. He interviewed Vecht first, retired by then, on a world with a heavy sky, and Vecht was courteous and precise and declined every invitation to describe himself as a victim of circumstance. He interviewed Sem, who had made Marshal herself and who said the useful thing, which was that no single decision had been made badly. He interviewed Vosk, who was 60, and who read him the 13 words off a printed page she took out of a drawer and put back. And he found in the registry archive the answer to the question everyone had stopped asking, which was why nothing had ever come back. Vosk's memorandum, and Vecht's 3 signals after it, had been routed by code to the Office of Strategic Reconciliation, Custodial Valuation Desk. That desk had been closed in a reorganization 4 years before Vosk ever filed. Its functions merged into an office with a different code, and the routing table had never been updated because updating a routing table for a desk that receives nothing is not a priority. The messages had arrived. They had gone into a queue that belonged to an office that did not exist. They were still there. Sand printed the queue listing, and it ran to 430 items, and his was the first pair of eyes ever to look at it. He wrote that down. Then he went to Yard 3. Hannah Duarte had died 6 years earlier, still director, and the brass drift pin had gone to Dev Marat, who was 49 and ran Cradle Systems now, which everybody in the authority regarded as the correct kind of joke. Walter Bell was 80 and came in on Tuesdays. Joaquin Ferreira was 64 and still had the paint shop, and when Sand asked him about the bow of Mount Hope, he said what he had said the first time, which was that it needed paint, and he said it in the same 3 words and then went back to cleaning a sprayer. Sand asked Bell his one question in the canteen, over the bad coffee, at a table bolted to the floor. He asked which single decision had changed everything. Bell took his time. He said it had not been the guns, because the guns were only as good as the last gauge reading. He said it had not been the tugs, because Theodore Vance had been dead 19 years and had never once claimed them. He said it had not been Duarte, though she had been the one who said, "Not yet," 11 times, and meant it every time. It was not a decision, Bell said. That is what nobody wants to hear. 214 years, 54 work orders a day, and not one of them was a decision. It was a habit. Somebody made it a habit before I was born, and nobody was ever important enough to change it. He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table, the way he had watched Duarte do it. The galaxy thinks the deadliest thing you can build is a weapon. The deadliest thing you can build is an institution that keeps doing an unglamorous job long after everyone has agreed it does not matter. Sand wrote it down. Mount Hope went back into custody on the 60th day and had not moved since. Book value, 0. 288 hulls in rows 4 kilometers apart. Dark, frosted, scraped back in patches where somebody needed a hull number. Nobody in the Kestrel Deep celebrated any of it, then or after. There was nothing to celebrate. 208 employees of an authority that officially did nothing had died in a place with no name, and 190 of them had died because a young man had decided a rule was for people with less nerve than him, and their names were on the back of a work order in a drawer in an old man's kitchen, and had never been read out anywhere, because reading them out was not something the yards did. The authority went back to the schedule inside 30 hours and had never come off it since. 58,000 people, 5 yards, 38 cradles, 122 tugs, and a coffee machine at Dock 4 that still dispensed brake fluid, having been replaced 4 times with an identical model. On the morning after Sand left, Dev Marat came out onto the cradle deck at the 6th hour with a piece of chalk, a torque wrench, and the walk-down card Bell had taught him off by heart when he was 23 and stupid. He started at the bow, under 400 meters of white letters that Ferreira touched up every spring, and he worked aft. He chalked 2 plates that had gone thin at the edge. He checked 11 fasteners and found one at the low end of tolerance and marked it. He wrote the pump number, the date, and the code in the book in the locker at the end of the walkway, in pencil, the way it had always been written, and the way it would be written by somebody else long after him. Like for like.